want to thank everybody for coming. I am Peter Lilienthal, president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. And thank you for joining us today for Life in Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th century with Jill Culiner. Couldn't think of a more appropriate subject to have today. And before I turn the program over to Marcy, I have to congratulate her as being vice president of our programming committee, who had the foresight to ask Jill to be with us today.
It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jill wrote us for a positive program. When I read her email about the book she has written, I was immediately sold. And one of the books, what was about the Romanians and their emigration to North America around the turn of the century, in that 20th century, I should say. That's the exact time that my father's family came to New York. So it was a done deal. And since I'm in charge of programs, who's gonna say no to me? Jill was born in New York, but raised in Toronto. She has lived in England, Turkey, Germany, Hungary, and settled in a small town in France in a 400-year-old house, which is classified as a museum. When I asked her why did she settle in France, she told me that as an artist and photographer, most of her exhibitions have been in France. She wears many hats: a social critical artist, a narrator, a writer, and photographer. Her exhibition on the lost Jewish villages toured France, Canada, and Hungary under the auspices of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and UNESCO. I recently just read her book, Finding Home in the Footsteps of Jewish Fusgeyers, which means wanderers in Yiddish. She relived their story by also walking across Romania. I greatly admired her for her fortitude and perseverance, but I also felt she was a little bit mashugana for doing it. So on that note, I want to introduce you to Jill. Jill?
Thank you very much, Marcy, for being Meshuggah. Well, I guess so. I mean, why not? It's a compliment.
I could never have done that.
Mittel diapo, oui. I'll show you there. There. Can you see my slides too?
Yes.
These are the two books I wrote, and the reason why I wrote these two books is because, why was I fascinated by Eastern Europe? Well, it started with Velvel Zbarzher. Velvel Zbarzher is a completely forgotten poet and singer. He was a Hebrew poet, a Yiddish poet and singer, and nobody knows about him today. And he was from Galicia, and he went to Romania, and that started me on this whole trail, and it got me on the trail of the Fusgeyers as well. And I'll explain why it was such a fascinating time, because the 19th century was a moment of great creativity, and the Jewish world changed radically in the 19th century, and it's little known how it changed. I think we have to start before the 1500s. There was always an early Jewish presence in Eastern Europe. There was the kingdom of Ruthenia, which is now Ukraine. There were always Jews there, but we don't know very much about them. But after 1500, Jews were fleeing pogroms and blood libels in Germany, England, France, Spain, and Portugal. And some of them went to the Ottoman lands, and they became the Sephardim. And the ones who came to Poland were the Ashkenazim. And Yiddish because they came from the German lands, Yiddish became the basis for their language, which incorporated Hebrew words and Slavic words. Now, in 1569, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was created. And this was a vast country that stretched over what is Ukraine now, the Balkan states. It went all the way to what would now be the border of Romania, which was then later became part of the Ottoman Empire. So there were these two major empires. And in this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the nobles were the most powerful. There was a king, but the nobles were the most powerful. And they ran their estates like mini countries. They went into battle with each other and just for amusement. They had thousands and thousands of villages. The important ones had thousands of villages and thousands, tens of thousands of peasant serfs. And they were the most powerful in the country. And you could never contradict a noble, you could never question him. But their wealth and their position depended upon their peasants, their serfs, and their Jews. Now, most peasants were serfs, and keeping them as ignorant as possible was the best way of ensuring their servility. They could be beaten to death, they could be tortured for amusement, but the nobles needed them. And they also needed their Jews, because the Jews were the middlemen. They were the ones that sold the products that the serfs produced. And they were the ones that administered the finances, they lent money, they managed forests, and they kept the nobles wealthy. Of course, most of the Jews were shopkeepers, water carriers, butchers, hawkers, shoemakers, and the people, the Luftmenschen. We've all heard of Luftmenschen. Nobody knew exactly how they lived. They had a few sheep, goats, chickens, a cow or two, and basically they lived like the people in this village that you see. By the end of the 1700s, however, the Commonwealth came to an end because of internal chaos and economic weakness. And Prussia, Russia, Austria, Russia, and Austria divided up what had been this big Commonwealth. It became Austrian Galicia. The Jewish part became the Russian Pale. And it was time, perhaps, to change an attitude, because the Polish nobles were no longer there to protect their Jews. However, life was extremely traditional. Every aspect of Jewish daily life, eating and dressing and behavior, was ruled by an elaborate framework of commandments. Non-Jewish learning was forbidden. Independent thinkers were threatened with magical retribution, excommunication, and expulsion. And if anybody deviated from piety, they were the butt of collective humor, and they could even be stoned. And young boys, as young as 2 or 3, sometimes attended the Heder, and in a dimly lit hut where they just rocked back and forth, mimicking the teacher's words. But in the 19th century, the modern world was knocking at the door, and the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, had begun in Germany, and it arrived in Eastern Europe. And these were modern men, as you'll see in the photo. They were called the Maskilim, and they knew now that the Commonwealth was over, that the Jewish world had to adapt to change. And Jewish isolation had to end. The Jews had to become part of the modern world. Modern education had to be introduced, and reason and superstition had to be vanquished. And Jewish children had to go to modern schools and learn, where they would learn modern European languages and science, geography, languages, history, mathematics, grammar, and philosophy. And this sounds so normal to us now, but back then these were forbidden studies. Now, most of these maskilim, these radical men, they had been raised traditionally, and they had come from small communities. But when they became modern thinkers, they were usually banished from their communities. And that basically was the story of Benjamin Ehrenkrantz, the Velvel Zbarzher. Okay, tu peux changer. Now, Benjamin Ehrenkrantz, his father was a ritual slaughterer named Moshe Shochet, and he studied the Talmud religiously, and he passed his religious fervor on to all 4 of his sons. But it was soon clear that the most talented son was Velvel. And like any proud father at the time, he thought that his son would eventually become a very important rabbi in a big community. And this was the greatest honor for a Jewish father. But somehow, and we don't know how, Velvel came in touch with the heretical modern thinking. Somebody passed on to him the Moses Mendelssohn's German Bible, written in Hebrew letters and accompanied by a rationalist interpretation. And because Velvel was a very smart kid, he started hiding underneath the synagogue steps in Zbarzher and teaching himself German. This is what the synagogue looks like today. I couldn't get access to find the steps where he was, but that's what it is now. It's now an office building. Anyway, he hid under there. He taught himself German, and he started reading this rationalist interpretation of the Bible. And he realized that how much was missing from his education. And he too started becoming a modern man in his head, but he didn't want to challenge his father. He didn't want to challenge the local community, so he hid that he hid his ideas. But in a small village like Zbarzher, you can't really hide what you're thinking. And eventually, rumors were flying through the village, and they headed for his father's ears. And his father said, how could my son become a radical? How can he become a heretic? We're going to have to nip this in the bud. What we'll do is we'll get him married. So he went and he looked for a suitable bride. Because Velvel was now 18 years old. If he was married and he had kids, he would have less time to be a radical. Now, this is what I find very, very, very interesting. Only in those days, only a very tiny minority of Jewish girls attended a few years of school. Most of them remained home. They helped with the household duties. They raised their younger brothers and sisters. They learned the daily prayers and the religious obligations, and they acquired the skills necessary for running the family business. Because any woman who married a pious man, she was the one who was responsible for bringing in money, bringing in money to the house, because her husband, he would spend his day praying. Other things that a bride needed, she had to have a full figure, she had to have no imperfections, she had to have pale skin that showed that she didn't work in the fields, and she couldn't have any blemishes. She could have moles, but if she had a mole in the middle of her forehead, that wasn't acceptable. And she couldn't have a hairy mole, and she couldn't be maimed, and she couldn't have halitosis, and her breasts couldn't be too far apart. And she couldn't sweat too excessively either. If anybody found out that she had these flaws, a nuptial agreement could be annulled. And if you discover that after marriage, she could be divorced immediately. Women had to be perfect. Moshe Shochet found the perfect bride for Velvel. She was a colleague's daughter. Her name was Chasia. She was very beautiful. And the marriage took place. And once he was married, Velvel realized what a mistake he'd made. There, for the rest of his life, he'd be locked into his father-in-law's house because you went to live with the bride's family, and he would study for the rest of his life. He'd be married to a woman who didn't have any education, whereas he had been studying now for years, secretly. And he had sold himself basically to appease his community. So he did the only thing he possibly could. He disappeared. And nobody knew what had happened to him. A passing traveler who passed through Zbarzher years later said, oh, he's alive and well, he's in Romania. Now, in those days, this is Romania. In those days, in the 19th century, Romania was considered a very desirable destination for Jews who were fleeing poverty and the problems related to overpopulation in Galicia and the lack of economic development, because Austria didn't care about developing their province at all. Russian Jews had another problem, because after 1827, the Jews were being drafted for a 25-year term of service into the Russian army. It wasn't only Jews, it was other people as well. But the Jews certainly didn't want to go into the Russian army, especially since they were often expected to be converted. I think some people have estimated between 17,000 and 40,000 Jewish kids were converted in the military service. But Romania was a new country. In 1848, the two areas, Moldavia and Wallachia, united, and they formed a new country. And one of the principles of the new country was that all the residents would become citizens, and this meant Jews as well. So this was a perfect place to go. Now, earlier on, Jews had come to the country. They had come to the country in the 15th century, after their pogroms in Europe as well. Many of them came from Galicia. The Sephardic Jews, they stayed down in Wallachia, and they were, as part of the Ottoman conquest, they were physicians, they were diplomats, and there were many Sephardic businessmen who were running successful banking institutions in the 19th century. And quite a few had also assimilated into upper middle class society. But the Moldavian Jews, this was completely different, because they had come from the German lands in the 14th and 15th century, and they hadn't evolved at all. They spoke Yiddish, they were conservative, they were pious, and they were under the influence of Hasidism. They lived in overcrowded houses on filthy back streets. They didn't care about democracy. They didn't care about citizenship at all. But for the other incomers coming from Galicia and Russia, they were thrilled to be in Romania because the economy was booming. They were attracting businesses. There were businesses, Jewish businesses on all the different streets. Jews could own vineyards. They could serve in the army, and new synagogues could be built. So it was, and craftsmen were welcome. So it was quite a wonderful place to be. Now, what were the towns like in Velvel's day? Well, they were usually unpaved back roads with small wooden houses with two main streets. And because so many people were coming into the country, there were problems, but it was the same problems in North American towns as well. The water distribution, it was through public fountains and standpipes and wells, and the only privies were courtyard dung heaps, and garbage and fecal matter were dumped out into the street, and they mixed with liquid that was coming from the stables and the horse droppings. And in the poorest houses, families crowded together into one or two rooms, and they were also workshops for candle making, leather tanning, and sorting filthy rags. And there was lice, and there were bed bugs, and there were cholera epidemics. And this happened in North America as well. This is typical 19th century. Velvel arrived in Botoshani, and he tried to be a businessman, but he failed. He was no good at it. He probably lacked an aptitude for wheeling and dealing. He thought, well, maybe he could become a poet. You know, how could he feed himself on Hebrew verse? Probably not, because writers had to pay to have their work published in the new Hebrew and Yiddish magazines. So then he thought, well, perhaps he could teach. The problem is that the Hasidic community, they were the ones that had their hands on education, and nobody modern was allowed to come and teach. Fortunately, there were wealthier, enlightened Jews, and they were hiring Galician and Russian masculine as private tutors for their children. And eventually, a man who owned a wine bar, he hired Velvel as a private tutor. And it was a pretty comfortable job. Velvel, there were two kids to take care of. He had time to write poems in the back room, and there was no stress on him. But, you know, he wanted more in life. He wanted to influence people to join the Haskalah. He condemned this stronghold, this religious stronghold. And so he wrote his poems condemning superstition and the ghetto lifestyle and the ignorance of the Hasidic Rebbes, who were very, very wealthy at that time. They purchased castles, they purchased whole towns, and they drove around the countryside in fine carriages, while their followers abandoned their wives and their children and just followed them, giving their last coins for exorcisms and amulets to ward off the evil eye. This was Velvel. One evening, Velvel was invited to come and eat with the family, where he was a tutor. And after having had quite a bit of wine, he started singing his own poems about the superstition. And he had a beautiful singing voice, and people loved what he was doing. They cheered him on. And that's when he realized maybe he could use his talent to do something else. He started going to the local cafes in towns, singing his songs, and very soon he had a large following of people who were singing his songs and encouraging him. Now, his criticism of society appealed to one group of men who were very important, who were very important fans of his. They were workers and craftsmen, Jewish workers and craftsmen, who had been apprenticed and sent off to labor in factories. And these men who had never attended Talmudic schools, and they mixed with Christians in the working world, they were discriminated against. They were considered inferior because they didn't have Talmudic studies. And they needed a spokesman, and Velvel became their spokesman. Soon he became so famous that people started copying his poems and presenting them as their own. He was also a very, very generous guy. I mean, he was drinking. Sometimes he would drink and he would never even remember to finish his own poems. And his friends would copy them down, and he would have to write them down in the morning. So it was easy to plagiarize his work. Now, who were the people who were copying him? Some of you might have heard of the Broder Singers. Now, who were the Broder Singers? They were really quite famous. There was no Yiddish theater at the moment, but there was a baker from the town of Brody. And Brody was on the frontier between Russia and Galicia. And this was a main border post, and that's where all the businessmen, the Russian businessmen, Jewish Russian businessmen, there were wealthy international traders, they used to come across this border. And in order to attract their custom, innkeepers started providing entertainment. They would have magicians and acrobats and bear shows. But this apprentice baker from Brody, Yakovo Dubinsky, he had done military service in Vienna, and he had seen cabaret theater there, and he thought it was the most wonderful thing in the world. And he thought that Galicia should have this as well. So he came back to Brody, he dressed himself up in sheepskins, he blackened his face, and he started doing song and dance routines in the cafes. And people loved it. But it was a guy called Burl Broder, whose real name was Margulis. He was a brush salesman, and he also started doing song and dance routines. He taught himself how to play the violin, and he became a traveling salesman, and he traveled all around Galicia, and he started singing and playing his violin and singing Yiddish songs that all began with, "I am a lone and lonely traveler." And soon he was being copied by people who called themselves Broder Singer, and they traveled all over Romania and all over Galicia. So in a way, this was a beginning of the Yiddish theater. But we're back to Velvel now. Now, this was the old border. Velvel, even though he was criticizing the stronghold, the religious stronghold, there was a new anti-Semitism that was also starting to grow with Romanian nationalism. Now, there was a small Romanian intelligentsia that existed, but there wasn't much of an industrial bourgeoisie. And commercial life was in the hands of Hungarians and Greeks and Germans and Jews. And Romanians started resenting this very much. But Velvel said that Moldova's Jews were partly responsible for anti-Semitism. He said they didn't care about Romania. They never bothered learning Romanian. They didn't care about the country. And the religious people, they were still defending their old-fashioned way of life. They were opposed to learning. They didn't found any schools. In 1859, when Alexandru Cuza, who had been a prominent figure in the 1848 revolution, when he said that he was more than willing to emancipate the Jews, grant them citizenship in exchange for a financial payment. But the Jewish community didn't seize the opportunity. They argued about how much money they were going to pay, and the Orthodox claimed they didn't need citizenship, that would only encourage modern thought, and that would cause believers to stray from the righteous path. So the result of all the dithering was that in 1866, when the Constitution was produced, the seventh article stated that Romanian citizenship would be restricted to the Christian population only, and Jews, Romanian Jews, were now foreigners. Now, as they were foreigners, new laws started being introduced. The sanitary laws forbade Jewish pharmacists to acquire or manage pharmacies. Jewish doctors had to give up their posts if a Romanian wanted it. Jews could no longer work in psychiatric institutions. They couldn't be received as free patients in the hospitals. And laws against peddling were put into effect, and shop owners and market sellers were sometimes, all their goods were taken away from them. They were beaten, they were thrown in jail. And the tobacco trade was cleared of Jews, and Jews had always been had the bars and been part of the liquor trade, but this also was now being forbidden to them. Eventually, 20,000 Jews found themselves on the streets in Romania and dying of starvation. And there were many suicides. Velvel said Romania is a beggar's bowl of a country. It needed Jewish linguists to develop its language and to teach Romanians about trade and craft. And how are they rewarded? Their Jews are being treated as foreigners. Because Velvel attacked the government, but he also attacked the Jewish religious stronghold, the Hasidic leaders denounced him to the government, and after 25 years in Romania, he was finally expelled. Now he returned to Galicia, and he continued shuttling from town to town, singing in bars, singing in inns. He went to Lvov, where there were the very famous coffee houses. He also went to Vienna. Now, everybody has a wonderful idea of Vienna, the Jewish coffee houses and how Jews did so well in Vienna, and the coffee houses were elegant and large and famous. But this is a very, very false picture. There were well-off Jews that did frequent these establishments. Many of them had come from Lemberg and Krakow, important cities, and they had adopted middle-class ideas. But most of the Jews who came from Romania and Galicia and from the small towns, they couldn't afford accommodation. They lived in day beds, night beds, much like the Jews who arrived in New York at the beginning of the century. They crowded into one-room apartments. There was an enormous amount of prostitution amongst the Jewish women. Children had rickets, and Jewish beggars were crowding the streets. So this is a completely different image of Vienna than the one we usually have. At one point, Velvel also went to Odessa, and in Odessa, he went to visit a friend of his, Verbel. And Verbel had a new son-in-law whose name was Avram Goldfaden. Now, Avram Goldfaden, he had written several Yiddish poems and catchy songs, and he'd also written 2 plays. But in the 1870s, there was no Yiddish theatrical tradition. There was no audience. There were no theaters in which to perform Yiddish plays, and there were no Yiddish actors. So what was the point of it? Goldfaden went to Czernowitz. He tried to start a newspaper, but he didn't have any success. And we're lucky that he didn't have any success, because then he went to Romania. And in Romania, he decided he was going to start Yiddish theater. Now, he hired as his first actors, he hired shopkeepers and cantors. There were women who were running away from arranged marriages or from menial work, and they all joined as actors and actresses. And his theater was apparently quite appalling. It's an avance-pas. His theater was apparently quite appalling. It was cantors, but one of his actors, David Kessler, said, if you think Yiddish theater was bad, Romanian theater was even worse. The slideshow seems to have vanished, but that's it. Eventually, Goldfaden's theater became so well known that it traveled to North America, and every single, even the small communities in North America, bragged a theater. C'est parce que le PowerPoint a planté.
Implanté?
Oui, c'est implanté. Il faut recommencer.
Oui, mais je peux pas, j'ai pas la souris.
Ok,
Là.
non, c'est pas
Remets la
grave.
souris. Je sais pas où
Non, mais tout est planté. Do you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, because we're having technical difficulties here. We can't advance the slideshow, so we'll just have to keep it as it is. By the time that Velvel went to Romania, no se mort. By the time he went to Galicia, the Haskalah was over. It was the 1870s. The world had become quite modern. Even in Zbarzher, the town where he had grown up, there were Polish, there were Jewish statesmen, they were participating in government. In Russia, the Jews had, as of the 1860s, they were becoming middle class. They were adapting to Russian society. It was a bit different than Romania, where they were being discriminated against. People were quite hopeful that life was going to be quite modern and sophisticated in Galicia and Russia. The problem is that there was also Polish nationalism. And with Polish nationalism, there was anti-Semitism. And the same thing happened in Russia. Jews were accused of owning land, of running the railways, of being too successful. And there was pogroms started there as well. To go back to Romania, in 1870, after Benjamin Peixoto, the first American consul to the principles of Moldavia and Wallachia, he visited Bucharest and he tried to influence the government on behalf of the country's Jews. But new pogroms convinced him that je ne sais pas qu'est-ce que c'est. Do you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, but it was quite clear that the government wasn't going to make any concessions to the Jews. So the only solution then would be to go to America, mass immigration to the United States. Local Jewish communities began forming immigration societies that took up subscriptions to pay for the costs of those who were willing to leave. And they provided maintenance for widows, the elderly, and for the disabled who would remain. One destination of Jews leaving Romania was Israel, and Romanians founded two of the oldest villages. But London and Paris, with their big Jewish communities, also attracted many people. Now, many people set off to try and go on foot to reach the Austro-Hungarian border, but the risks were great because they were unprotected, they were arrested by the police, and they were thrown into prison. And so finally, some people, apparently a group of a young theatrical amateur theater group in the town of Berlad, hit upon the idea that if they formed a group and if they all walked together, then they could protect each other. And if they gave Yiddish theater productions all the way along the road, all the way to the border, then they could earn money to pay for their passage. So they set out, and this was the first group of Fusgeyers. Now, the Fusgeyers, there were perhaps hundreds of Fusgeyer groups. We don't know because nobody recorded it. Only one manuscript was ever written by a man called Finkelstein, who was a Fusgeyer, who participated in the first group. Apparently, people were so fascinated by these groups. They wore uniforms, they marched, they sang, they were very, very dignified. And apparently the peasants were so fascinated by these people who were passing across the country on foot that they gave them food along the way, they gave them wine, they gave them milk, and they were really seen as in a very positive way. Of course, the government hated this propaganda, which they felt was propaganda, pointing out how anti-Semitic the government was. Now, we don't know how many Fusgeyer groups existed or how many participants there were in each. Sometimes there were 40, sometimes there were 10, and sometimes there were several hundred. They were usually craftsmen. Now, because they were so admired, unfortunately, other people started setting out as Fusgeyer groups. They hadn't trained themselves. They were families with small children, and many of them ended up starving or dying in groups all along the country. It was terrible. So the only thing that could be done was to stop this movement immediately and to raise money to help people get to America, because they were determined to go anyway. Now, one of the Jewish myths is that people talk about how their relatives walked all across Europe. This wasn't possible because they were stopped at the Austro-Hungarian border. They weren't allowed to go any further. They were helped on across Europe on trains all the way across Europe. And in the ports, they were also helped by Jewish aid agencies in Germany, in Austria, Jewish agencies in America and in France. This was to stop suffering so they could take trains and go in a dignified way to America. Now, it's estimated that between 1881 and 1900, 750,000 Jews left Eastern Europe. And by 1914, another 1,600,000 immigrated, mostly from Russia and Galicia. They went to Palestine, they came to France, Germany, England, America, South Africa, and Australia. And between 1871 and the First World War, almost 30% of Romanian Jews migrated to Canada and the United States. And most of them ended up in the terrible sweatshops that we know about in New York and Chicago and places like that. There's one story that's really quite close to my heart. When I was trying to trace, yes, I walked across Romania trying to find the Fusgeyers, following the exact same itinerary that Finkelstein had written about. And at one point, I started taking trains at the former Austro-Hungarian border, just like the Fusgeyers had done. And at one point, I found myself in Nuremberg. And in Nuremberg, I was looking in the archives for any trace of the Fusgeyers. And of course, there's no trace from anything. And because, they were just immigrants like the rest. By the time they had left the country, they were just immigrants. They weren't Fusgeyers anymore. But I was in the archives, and I asked the archivist if I could see anything, if there was any record of Jewish immigrants passing through the country. And he said, no, well, there were no records left. The Nazis had destroyed all the papers in the archives. He said, but if you want, apparently we have one little folder. Do you want to see? It's just one little folder that wasn't destroyed. Do you want to see that? And I said, sure, of course. Yes, please. And I waited. And this one little folder of 2 pages arrived, and it was a folder from the 1900. And in it, they were talking about the Romanian Jews who had walked across their country, who at that moment were sitting in the train station and waiting to be helped on. And that moment was such a touching moment, the last page, the last thing that had survived of that period. So I knew I was on the right track. And basically, that's the story of the Fusgeyers. That's where they came from. I don't know, Marcy, do you want to ask questions now, or would you like me to talk more about...
Well, can you talk about the translation you did of Find at Evo?
Well, yeah, I found out that Finkelstein had written his itinerary. And so I asked Yivo to send me a copy of it. And there were no documents about the first. There was one history book that was written. There were just a couple of chapters, and then Finkelstein's manuscript. So I found a copy of this one history book, and Yivo sent me Finkelstein's manuscript. And of course, both were written in Yiddish, which I couldn't speak. And because I was in the west of France, way out in the west of France, I mean, who was going to help me translate Yiddish? So it happened to be wintertime, and it was very cold, and I live in a very cold old house. And so I bought myself a copy of college Yiddish, and I went to bed and I learned Yiddish. And I was able to translate little by little Finkelstein's manuscript. And Finkel's manuscript was really, it really was an itinerary. He would say things like, we walked for 3 hours and we got to a river after we left Buzău. And amazingly enough, as I was walking across Romania, I followed his manuscript. I didn't know which road he had taken, but I walked for 3 hours and I got to the river as well. And that's what it was like for following his itinerary. It was quite wonderful. He was wrong about, because he wrote it many years later, he was wrong about the place of some places, but I basically found every single thing that he talked about. And even when he talked about anti-Semitic towns, I found those same towns to be very hostile when I was asking about the Fusgeyers or about Jews who had once lived there.
How long did you spend actually walking, the whole version, walking and then, the rest of it?
Basically walking. I was walking 20 to 30 kilometers a day. And stopping if there were archives or things like that, or sore feet, stopping for a day or two. Finkelstein and his group, of course, they were taken in by the Jewish community as they walked. I didn't have a theatrical performance to present, and the Jewish communities in many of the towns where they were several hundred in his time, now there were 3 or 4 or 5 Jews left in the towns. So, I basically tried to stick to his schedule. I think it took me around a month.
I questioned, he talked about how many Jews there were, this place, that place. How does he know that? I mean, it wasn't like he could, go on the computer and find it out. Is that a guess on his part, or he think he got information?
Well, I think there was, because he was staying with the Jewish community, I think people knew at that time, yes, how many Jews were in the community. Plus, in my book, I talk about the aid that was extended to, from the Alliance Israélite that was helping Romanian Jews at the time. So, they knew how many Jews were living in each town. Jews were quite a distinct society at that time. They were being discriminated against, and people knew who they were and where they were in Romania. In Galicia, it was a bit different. In Galicia, I found that Jews and Christians, they often lived in the same areas in some places in towns. Or else another configuration was that Jews lived in the center where there was a market square, and the peasants lived on the outskirts where there were fields and they had barns. And to this day, if you go to towns in the Ukraine, you find the same configuration. You find the peasant houses out near the edge, and what were once the Jewish parts in the center around the main square. You can still see it. The layout is there.
I was surprised, and maybe not surprised, that so many towns insisted there were never any Jews there, and there isn't any Jewish cemetery, and then you wind up finding out. Do you think they're in denial, or they have such hate that they don't know, or they never were told?
I think people are ignorant. From living in Hungary and from where people also, I lived in villages. I've just finished writing another book about that. I've lived in villages where Jews did live, and the people in the village said, no, there were never any Jews there. There never had been. Basically because after the Holocaust, it was forbidden by the communist regime to talk about the Holocaust. The war was simply discussed as it was fascists and good people, and the fascists lost and the good people won. There was no talk of a Holocaust. There was no, everybody was a victim of fascism. And it was forbidden to talk about the Jewish community and what had happened to it. And that was true in former Galicia, now Ukraine. That was true in Hungary. That was true in Romania. So it's largely ignorance. A few teachers dared, and I did talk about that in the Fusgeyer book. One man said to me, he said, we had a teacher who said that there had been Jews in this village, but we weren't allowed to talk about it other than that.
Just as a quickie, I am getting messages in the chat And,
Yeah.
and Jill, I'm just wondering if your slide presentation, if you could just, if there be a way to interrupt it, because we see
Yeah.
Avram very well, and I'm just trying to get to
Il
the
faut
chat.
arrêter ça.
Je peux pas le faire.
The problem is that we can't. It's just been blocked.
Faut que tu rebranches
Oh, I see.
les brancher
Le branchement.
la mémoire.
That's all right. Just continue. I didn't mean to interrupt, Jill. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's okay
Yeah,
because
good.
because the PowerPoint is blocked.
Ouais, je
There's
vois
no
pas.
way we can't. I would have to sign off.
Je sais pas ce qui s'est passé, mais
C'est planté.
oui,
PowerPoint c'est planté.
j'essaye de sortir de là. Alors, si tu fais en même temps que moi, ça va pas marcher.
No, no, we can't. I can't stop the share because my computer has blocked.
Okay.
Si, mais j'essaie. Ne touche pas.
Okay, let's just then leave it, Jill. I wouldn't want to interrupt what you're doing.
Okay, but we can do the questions as that. It's,
Je peux rien faire.
Okay. We have a question that says, I believe one ought to mention tremendous contribution which many Jews brought to enhance Romanian culture. For example, Moses Gaster, who later became the chief Sephardic rabbi of England, was a prominent Romanian linguist and played a crucial role in Romanian education.
yes. Yes, this is true.
Okay.
It's quite funny because Gaster, amazingly enough, in my book, I mentioned that Finkelstein found that Gaster was a big enemy. He wasn't very sympathetic towards the Romanian Fusgeyer movement, and he apparently had a big fight with them in London when the Fusgeyers were waiting for a ship, and c'est pas ça, c'est PowerPoint qui a planté.
Essaye de brancher celle-ci.
And
Oui, c'est celle-là.
I can't tell you more than that, other than Gaster. Gaster was one of the many, but
How did you learn Romanian?
sorry, Marcy.
How did you learn the Romanian language to speak to these people as you traveled?
I was quite fortunate because I had a friend, Yves Bernard, who thought I was absolutely crazy to walk across Romania all by myself. And he said it was too dangerous and I couldn't do that. So what he said, he would accompany me, he would walk with me. And he was very nice and he learned Romanian for the walk. I learned Yiddish, he learned Romanian, and that's how we got on.
Okay, all right. Any other questions? Peter, you have anything?
Well, I think what you just read is exactly what I had also, Marcy. And I want to thank very much Marcy and you and Jill for making this connection with Jill. I think the very fact that she's in Paris and you're here, I thought it was really quite exciting. And of course, as we looked at the various programs that we have coming up, obviously very important is Remembering the Family Store, which we expect to be shown in June. It was a project that was started with a slide presentation way back when, and Gail in the community and so on. And we feel that it's one of the wonderful heritages of our community. And so when that comes along, I'm sure that many will want to see the movie. There'll be a clip of that to begin with, and that people can get a feel of it. So
one last thing I want to say, Jill, I was going to invite you to, we have a conversational Yiddish group.
Yeah.
But now they're starting to meet in person. They were meeting under
Oh, right. Yeah, with Zoom. Yeah.
Zoom, but now it's in person. But it was until now done by Zoom. You might enjoy it. It's like
I might have enjoyed it. The thing is, Marcy, that I learned how to read Yiddish and I learned how to translate it, but I never spoke it. Who would I speak it with?
Yeah, yeah.
Are there any other questions that anybody's asked that I should, because I can't see them. but you can read them.
Well, I think that if people could unmute themselves, and if you have a question, is to merely ask it, and why don't we handle it that way?
Okay.
And I know you've been trying to put it in the chat, and it hasn't been really working for me. But if anybody has a question that they could unmute themselves, please go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I have a question. Any thoughts on how a Jew could become of Ukraine today? Because I had always heard that Ukraine was very anti-Semitic and actually welcomed the Nazis because they were better than the Russians. So any thoughts on that?
The thing is that history is a very funny thing. All the time I spent in Ukraine, I never felt any anti-Semitism. As the president is Jewish of Ukraine, other politicians are. There's a very lively, healthy, strong, or there was until the last few days, strong Jewish community in Kiev. And people are very low. There are many, many Jews returning to the Ukraine to form a strong society. Now everybody's running away, but hopefully, eventually it will form again. Ukraine isn't anymore, I don't find that it's more anti-Semitic than other. Look, just look at right now Poland, okay? This is just another example. Poland is accepting all the Ukrainian refugees that are coming over with open arms, okay? They're welcoming them into their homes. The Poles and the Ukrainians hated each other's guts. They massacred each other.
Wow.
Up until the end of the Second World War, they killed each other. And now life changes and things change. And that's what happened with you. Yes, there were Ukrainians who massacred Jews. That's true. And they worked with the Nazis. But at the same time, life changes. People change.
Yeah. Okay.
A situation changes. Propaganda changes.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have any plans to do any research about the northern Jewish communities of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, that part of the Pale, that part of the Jewish world, the way you have researched Romania and the Galicia and the southern Jewish communities during the 18th and 19th centuries.
It sounds very interesting. I guess I'd love to eventually. As I said, I've just finished writing a book. It isn't published yet, on Hungary and the Hungarian Jews. So I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go after that. I might also be interested in investigating French Jews and French Jewish society, because this is something that's little known as well.
Someone wrote that the largest Chabad is in Ukraine.
Yeah. Yes, and then they're restoring many of the old synagogues and the old communities. Yes.
Do you know if that wooden synagogue that you showed us is still up?
Very few of the wooden synagogues are still standing. You can, there is a site called Jewish Heritage. There's a Jewish Heritage site. You can, I don't have the address right now. If you want, if you're curious, I can get it and send it to you.
No, I mean, it was a book.
Sorry?
There was a book written on the the wooden synagogues of Europe.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've seen wooden synagogues in Lithuania. I've seen quite a few of them. A lot of them are ruins, but they do exist, the ones that survived. And so many of them are being restored. The ones that survived. I mean, I didn't see any wooden synagogues that survived in Ukraine, although I saw many synagogues that did survive that no longer in Romania as well. The buildings are still there. And little by little, they're being put back together again. And they're becoming museums often.
You know what I find very interesting, Jill, and I think we all do, is what you said before about how the Poles are so open in terms of receiving the Ukrainians as they're coming across. And there's a very large younger Jewish, not Jewish only, but younger communities throughout Europe whose mindset is obviously very different from what it used to be.
Absolutely.
And it's
Absolutely.
quite a refreshing, not only refreshing, but heartfelt, the way in which the Western European communities are responding to the plight of the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And also the very fact that Zelensky is doing such a phenomenal job as a leader. And
He is, isn't he? It's amazing.
I'll be
Yes.
very proud that he and the number two there, I understand, is also Jewish. But
Yeah.
that has not been hidden in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it's been actually made very clear as the fact that Zelensky is in fact Jewish. So,
Yeah.
but this talk, very honestly, Jill, is very, very enlightening, and I found it terrific. And I look forward to your Hungarian Jewish heritage because that's mine. And
Oh, is it?
my grandparents were from Hungary. And
Yes.
have their story. And if at some point you'd like to chat, I'd be very happy to share what I have.
Oh,
But,
yes.
But it was very clear when they went to Vienna and emigrated to Vienna that my grandparents met in Vienna, and that started our family as it evolved from after the war. So it really quite a story.
Oh, yes, it is. Where were they from originally in Hungary?
Well, basically, it was a small town, just sort of to the small town on the. I'm just trying to think the name. I'm drawing a blank at the moment. I'm embarrassed because I was there a couple
This
of
happens
times.
to me all the time.
So the point is that it was southwest of Budapest.
Okay, yeah.
Samarin, it was the name of the town. It was called Samarin, and that's where they were from, and we visited there and so on, and it was just a phenomenal opportunity for us to visit.
Yes,
So
I can imagine. Yeah.
it was great.
Jill, your travels in Romania, did you go through my grandparents' place, Yassy? Y-A-S-S-Y?
Yes, of
Yeah.
course I know Yash very well. Yes, yes. Yes, it's a huge modern city now. That's quite a history, Yash. Quite a terrible history as well, but
That's why they
yeah.
So Jill, I'd like to thank you very much, and Marcy, for you making the connection. It was outstanding, and to get a sense, and those pictures were beautiful of what it was like in those days, of what it was to be Jewish in those days. And thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to just ask, and we'll be very happy to address them. Marcy's actually reading them in the chat, and I am now too.
Lester has a question.
Lester, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
You provided a lot of details. What
Yeah.
kind of archival and other resources are available as your source for all those details?
I'm quite lucky to live in Europe. I have archives in Germany. I mean, I'm lucky because I also speak fluent German. So, I have the archives at the Bibliothèque Nationale. I have the archives at the Alliance Israélite in Paris. I have archives in Germany. I have archives everywhere. Basically, the Bibliothèque Nationale and the Alliance Israélite here in Paris are wonderful sources. I was also able to find copies of Velvel's book that he sent to Paris. That was very touching to actually have a book that he wrote that he sent to Paris, and I was actually able to hold it. That's quite wonderful. I found many, many letters written by Jews who were quite desperate and trying to get out of Romania and suffering from anti-Semitism in the end of the 19th century. Those are also in the archives of the Alliance Israélite here in Paris, because that was the center that was coordinating all the Jewish aid services, the Alliance Israélite in Paris. So these are the best sources. I also, in Canada, I found records all the way across Canada because I traced the Fusgeyers out to the west of Canada. And of course, YIVO is wonderful. There's nothing better than YIVO, the archives at YIVO in New York. And there's so much literature. There are so many incredibly wonderful books that have been written about Jewish life and that are still being written now. It's very, very rich literature. We're very lucky, huh?
So it's all out there. It wasn't
It's all
destroyed,
there.
never
Yeah.
existed.
No, it's all there.
So again, for all of us, Marcy, Jill, thank you so much for such a fascinating story. And many of us do have our roots in Europe. And
Yes.
to actually see the evolution of Jewry from the time that you covered it. And your own story must be a terrific story. So the fact that you in fact moved to Europe, I'm sure that you have wonderful stories about yourself that in fact can in fact be told.
Someone said, Jill, we should thank your IT assistant also.
Oh, Bernard, who's here. Bernard, say hello.
Hi, Bernard. So if there are no further questions.
Well, just one last thing about my family. My family, because they had to live in a part of the town that was for Jews, they can only go to like 6th grade school. They can only have X amount of chickens, limited to like 1 or 2. So they felt there was nothing there for them there. I guess we had some relatives, I don't know who. My grandfather came first, and 2 months later, my grandmother decided she wasn't waiting, and she came with the 4 kids and 1 in the oven to follow him. And supposedly the story is when he opened the door, he says, Rachel, what are you doing here? And she said, I wasn't gonna wait. I love that story.
You want me to give you a wonderful book to read?
Okay.
The Man Who Swam into History.
The Man Who Swam into History.
Swam into History. It's by Robert Rosenthal, who's a professor of Jewish history in California. The Man Who Swam into History. You'll find it everywhere. It's wonderful, about Romania, about
Okay.
Romanian Jews and his Romanian family.
Okay.
And also, well, thank you very, very much, Peter, and thank you, Marcy.
Thank you.
Well,
And
this
thanks
was-
to the
this
Jewish
was-
Historical Society. Thank you, everyone, for coming today.
Well, I don't think there's anyone on this view today, and there were many who really enjoyed the talk very much. And it has been recorded. And if you would like, just send an email to us as you registered if you'd like to see the recording, and I'll see if I can't get this thing out to you too. So
And I'll have to send you the information about Lilienthal, who might have been one of your relatives in Russia, who was in charge of education in Russia.
well, thank you very much. I'd be looking forward to that. Take
Yeah.
care, everybody, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and of course to Marcy and Jill for making this happen.
All
Take
right.
care, everybody. All the
Bye-bye.
best.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.